Pippa.
Welcome everyone. We'll just give it another minute or so to wait for people to join and then we'll get underway. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou everyone. I'm Pippa Mitchell, the Managing Director at MRCagney, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. For those of you that don't know us, we're a leading provider of sustainable transport solutions for cities. And we help government agencies to plan and design and create equitable and sustainable transport systems. We host these webinars with an aim to connect people who are passionate about our kaupapa of equitable and sustainable transport with a range of global experts. We're going to kick this off shortly, but we had a couple of small housekeeping matters before doing so. The first one is please be aware that we are recording this webinar and we will be able to share it with you afterwards. Secondly, we do have the chat enabled, so we're quite keen to check that you can use it. If you feel like putting in the chat where you're joining us from, it would be great to hear from you. We'll also monitor the chat if anyone experiences any technical issues. We are going to also be using the question and answer option. You can type your questions into the Q&A at any time, but we are going to save questions until the end. We should have about 20 minutes for Q&A. You can also vote someone else's question up the ranking if you want to by giving it a thumbs up so we know which questions to prioritise when we get to that point. Our presenters today are Shane Martin and Stu Donovan. As MRCagney's principal economist, Shane is responsible for leading work on economic analysis and business cases. He has significant experience modelling the impacts of land use policies on housing markets in New Zealand and how land use and transport policies work together to shape our cities. With a PhD in economics and a long career working on large, complex data sets, his most valuable skill is his ability to explain complex modelling in easy to understand everyday language, ensuring that work can be understood by experts and non-experts alike. Before coming to MRCagney, Shane worked in the Chief Economist Unit at Auckland Council, where he provided a range of economic advice to council staff and elected officials. Stu is a Senior Fellow with Motu Research in Wellington. Stu holds a PhD in urban economics and has 2 decades of experience working in spatial, urban and transport economics, multimodal transport planning and land use policy in Australia, New Zealand and the Netherlands. Stu grew up in Waiuku, New Zealand and now lives with his family in Brisbane, Australia. Going for housing growth is part of the government's broader plan to tackle New Zealand's ongoing housing shortage, and Stuart and Shane will provide a background to this, including discussing how it's shaping up, what its impacts might be, and considering how we'll know if it's successful. They'll also discuss how it is similar and different to previous government housing policies. Over to you, Stu.
Actually, I think it might be over to me first. So, hi, I'm Shane Martin. I am just going to give you a brief outline and then I'll hand over to Stu and then I'll hand back to me. So, we're going to talk about a bit of problems and progress, the Going for Housing Growth proposals, and keep in mind that stage one of the proposals, some thoughts and reflections, and then a bit of a teaser about if you would like to learn more, how you might be able to do that. So I will pass over to Stu and then I'll be back with you shortly.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Shane. Thanks, Pippa. I hope you can hear me okay on the other side of the Tasman and wherever you are in the world. What I'd like to give you a sense for is background context to housing in New Zealand. And it's a bit grim in some respects, and quite a bit more glass half full in other respects. So just to start with, this graph, sort of what I'm trying to communicate here is that Aotearoa has a major housing problem. And you can sort of use different data to get a sense of this. This data is from the OECD. It looks at housing costs as a share of income. And what you want to focus on is the blue bar. You can see that New Zealand is towards the left-hand end of the bar. If you click Shane, hopefully that it will be highlighted. Yeah, there's New Zealand. So we're quite close to the top of the OECD in terms of the share of households that are spending more than 40% of their income on housing. 40% is sort of a bit of a threshold that indicates housing stress. If you then click again, Shane, you can see just how we compare to Australia. Australia is way, way down the list. So what this graph is communicating is that in Australia, there is approximately half as many households that are spending more than 40% of their income on housing. So, you know, I know the recent Olympic medal table, we did pretty well compared to Australia on a per capita basis, as they say. But in terms of housing costs, our neighbour is really beating us quite resoundingly. So next slide. That said, we have begun to turn it around. This graph shows the share of dwellings completed in the most recent year as a percentage of the total housing stock. So you can see New Zealand here is towards the left. So we're actually building a relatively high rate of housing per year, and we are actually building more than Australia. If you click again, Shane. The other thing to point out is that these sort of white squares or diamonds, if you click Shane, you can see that for New Zealand, that's 2011 data. You can see that New Zealand has almost doubled the rate at which we're building housing. So housing as a share of the existing housing stock. So we've gone from building quite low amounts to quite high amounts in the last decade. And this becomes more apparent on the next slide, which actually shows the number of building consents or approvals as a share, as a per 1,000 people in Australia and New Zealand. And you can see going back to year 2000, Australia has outbuilt New Zealand on a per capita basis for almost 20 years. And it's only been the last 3 or 4 years that New Zealand has managed to build more than Australia per capita. In this period, it's worth noting that New Zealand's population growth was actually higher than Australia. Our income growth might have been a bit lower, but it's, you know, you're looking at rates of housing construction between countries that are growing in terms of population at approximately the same rate. New Zealand might even be growing faster. This is good news, right? So we have bad housing outcomes in terms of the levels and the housing stress that we see, but we have begun to turn it around over the last decade or so, and you can see that we're building significantly more housing now than we were in the past, and we've managed to overtake Australia. But it will take a long time for us to, we have a backlog basically. There were 2 decades when we were building far fewer houses than we needed to, and we've only recently been starting to build at a faster rate. So if we want to get the sorts of outcomes that we see in Australia in terms of, you know, lower housing stress, we're going to need to sustain high rates of building for a long time. Next slide. Now, that increased supply, I want to be clear that this all looks like data on, you know, it is data in a graph. It's quite impersonal. it is having a real effect. So this increase in housing supply is helping to reduce housing costs. We have evidence on this that rents in Auckland after upzoning and the unitary plan fell significantly, between 20 to 30%. This is the rent for new dwellings, I should say. It's not dwellings over the whole market. It's the rent for new dwellings coming onto the market. So it is helping. But in terms of zoned capacity in New Zealand, and well, in Auckland at least, and I think the same would be true for New Zealand as a whole, even with the unitary plan, we are still far below historical levels of zone capacity. So this graph is from research by the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission to Waihanga. And what they've done here is they've looked at the ratio of zoned capacity, housing capacity, to the population of Auckland over time. And you can see that in the 1960s, the city went through a very significant downzoning, where we greatly reduced the amount of housing capacity that we had. The important thing to note here actually is that this downzoning preceded the RMA. So I know the RMA gets beaten up a lot, and by all means, it's not a perfect piece of legislation. But our housing capacity, or the seeds for the housing problems that we have seen over the last decade, were really sown back in the 1960s and 1970s. And of course, during that period, we didn't upzone until significantly, at least until the unitary plan. But that upzoning, even though it was quite broad, it was quite across the city, it was quite modest in terms of the density that it enabled. Most of the upzoning was sort of townhouses and small apartment blocks. So it only partly reversed the downzoning that we saw in the past. So even with the unitary plan, Auckland is still providing, or has zone capacity that is far, far less than what we've had in the past. So I think that is the context I would like to provide to the discussion today, is that, we have problems, we've made some progress, and now let's switch to thinking about how we might go further in the future. So with that, I'll pass over to Shane.
Great. Thanks, Stuart. That's a really good overview. That last graph I always find particularly, pick your adjective, interesting, damning, whichever one you want to pick. But it really is interesting, like how severely downzone Auckland was in particular at that time. So that's not what we're going to talk about, though. We're going to talk about going forward. So this is going for housing growth proposals. So these just came out recently, stage 1. And we will talk about, or I'm going to introduce some, and then Stu will have some reflections. So what is going for housing growth? It's intended to accomplish what we've been trying to do and have been unable to do so far. Those are my words, not their words, which is improve housing affordability and address the underlying causes of New Zealand's housing supply shortage. It really, one thing I'll stress is it addresses the supply side of the housing issue. That's not good or bad, it's just a fact about it. And it consists of 3 main work streams, or what they call pillars. We're going to focus on the first one today, which is freeing up land for urban development, including removing unnecessary planning barriers. The other 2 are improving infrastructure funding and financing. That's the one that I think is probably the key to this whole thing, but the details haven't been released yet. And the third one is providing incentives for communities and councils to support growth. So like I said, today we're going to talk about the first pillar, but keep in mind that second one is going to be very important. So what is in this first pillar? How do we free up land for housing? In the announcement, there are 6 changes outlined, which we're going to walk through. So I'm not going to read them to you, but because we're going to step through them. The first one is the introduction of housing growth targets. So tier 1 and tier 2 urban areas, really. And so the tier 1s are, for anyone who doesn't know, Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, Wellington, Christchurch are tier 1. And tier 2 is Whangarei, Rotorua, New Plymouth, Napier Hastings, Palmerston North, Nelson Tasman, Queenstown, and Dunedin. So that's just to give you an idea of when we talk about this applies to Tier 1 and Tier 2, that's who we're talking about. They will be required to enable 30 years of feasible housing capacity in their district plans. The key difference between existing what's in the National Policy Statement for Urban Development and what this is talking about is, I think here, which is using high population growth scenarios. And so it's not just allowing for 30 years of feasible housing capacity, it's doing that using high population growth projections, which wasn't a requirement before. There's also new central government tools to monitor compliance, and there's a requirement that price indicators do not deteriorate through time. So an example of this would be the difference in price between land zoned for rural and land zoned for urban use. So the differential in those in the prices of those types of lands, it's the idea is that that differential should not get worse through time. One thing I'd mention about this, I think in principle, that's a really good idea. The devil is always in the details, of course. Historically, that's been a bit difficult to calculate or to calculate well. And I'll just give you, I guess, you know, the 30-second version of that, which is the issue with land values is that most often, so like when you buy a house, you say, oh, I bought a house. Well, most of the time you actually bought a house and land, and you didn't pay separately for the house and the land usually. And so the land values are often not directly revealed, and they have to be imputed. And economists are pretty good at doing that, but we're not perfect. And so the idea that this differential needs to be consistent through time, the only thing I would say about that is we just need to make sure that we do a really good job estimating this. So that's not that it's good or bad. In fact, I think it's probably good. It's just a caution that it can be difficult to actually do the monitoring. Okay, so we have these housing growth targets. That's policy 1. Policy 2 is enabling greenfield growth. A couple of things in here are that councils are prohibited from imposing rural urban boundary lines in planning documents. So this would particularly affect Auckland, that has the RUB, the rural urban boundary. It's also that government is investigating options to require councils to plan for 50 years of growth, and that's up from 30, and requiring them to be more responsive to private plan changes. So a note on this slide is that this is going to heavily interact with reforms to infrastructure funding and financing, so that workstream 2 or pillar 2, which is forthcoming. I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention that if you've been following this in the news, this is probably the part that has gotten the most, well, I would say it's a key criticism of the policy from one side and a key praise of the policy from the other. And so what I would say is it's one of the things that gets talked about, which is this enabling greenfield growth. Taking an agnostic view of greenfield development, it's one thing I'd mention, just this is based on my own professional experience in this, that greenfield development has a couple of issues that can be addressed, but historically they haven't been. The first one, and really this is getting at what the Going for Housing Growth Pillar 2 around infrastructure is going to tackle, is that infrastructure for greenfield growth is incredibly expensive. Development contributions tend to not cover even, say, half of the cost of providing the infrastructure. The rest of it has to be paid for somehow. usually by ratepayers and taxpayers. If growth is meant to pay for growth, my worry is that the story might turn into, well, growth is unaffordable because it's very, very expensive to build the infrastructure. And if we pay all that money, if a developer pays all that money to build the infrastructure, then they won't be able to sell. The price they would have to get for the housing would be too high, and it makes the development infeasible. So that's just a thing to think about. And anyway, so I think that's probably, we could have an entire, probably, I don't know, 1 week short course just about this policy. So I'll move on from there. The third policy is getting intensification in the right places. Tier 1 councils must enable appropriate levels of density across their urban areas. They must deliver housing intensification along strategic transport corridors, things like bus routes, and they must directly offset any housing capacity lost due to reasons such as special character elsewhere. So that's just intensifications in the right places. There's detailed fact sheets on this, which you can get for some more detail. Having said that, I want to unpack this a little bit. There are a couple of things in here that I think are really good and will help streamline the process. So on the left-hand side here, you have what's currently the policy. On the right-hand side, you have the proposed one. But what I will do is focus on two of them. Allowing heights and density in line with the accessibility of services or demand for housing. A key to that is making sure we all agree what demand means. Just as having been in conversations within councils, it's not always agreed upon. So clear what that means. And the other one is that government will no longer let councils set catchment sizes. So if you see that's about halfway down, I'll talk about that a bit more. And then the stronger evidentiary requirements on decision makers to apply qualifying matters. All right, so really removing minimum catchment sizes from council discretion will streamline the process. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that like hundreds and hundreds of hours, at least at Auckland Council, were spent discussing what are the appropriate catchment sizes, and whether it's 800 meters or 1,000 meters or 600 meters, or what should they be here, what should they be there. Just taking that out of the hands and saying a catchment is this, I think will really streamline the process. The other is around stronger evidence needed to justify qualifying matters and offset the loss of capacity. So that map you see there, that's a map of the special character areas in Auckland. Now, without getting into whether that's too much or too little or anything like that, to justify that as a qualifying matter will require more evidence. And in my opinion, the evidence is actually quite thin on either side as to whether to keep or to retain, and that discussion needs to be had. All right, so moving quickly through, our next one is on policy 4, mixed use development. So to me, this one is around where you're allowing for more dense development. You also have to allow services to exist in those areas, like cafes, dairies, and other retail. It doesn't mean allowing industrial type activities there. That can be kept away from housing. And I think this is important because often access to amenities is used to justify why an area maybe can't handle intensity. Oh, we're going to put a lot of people there, but there's no services for them. Well, this would allow those services to exist. Policy 5, minimum area and balcony requirements. So the key to this is that councils cannot set minimum floor area requirements for anything, but primarily apartments would be where it's important, or require balconies. Now, of course, developers can still choose to build bigger apartments or apartments with balconies, but they're not required to. And the reason this is important is that if you look at the note there, some earlier research found that Auckland Council's minimum area requirements and balconies could add about $100,000 to the cost of a small dwelling. And that's a huge amount, right? Like $100,000 is not nothing. That's a big amount. I think this is, on balance, a really good one. And then finally, policy 6, which is making MDRS optional. This is probably the other one you would have seen in the news. Currently, under the MDRS, Tier 1 councils are required to enable up to 3 houses of up to 3 stories without a resource consent. This, going for housing growth, makes MDRS optional, provided councils meet the targets in some other way. I would say the relaxing of this, so this is where my professional opinion comes in, it's probably got some good things and bad things. The fact that it was MDRS was quite prescriptive could mean that you're essentially saying what's right for Auckland is right for Christchurch is right for Wellington on the one hand, but it also meant that it was difficult to argue about what is right for those areas. So one of the things that I just think to bring up here is MDRS was very straightforward in terms of this is what you must do. Now that it's been relaxed and councils can meet the requirement in other ways that they choose, it's potentially means that the process would take longer. All right, so that is a very quick overview of the 6 policies out of the Pillar 1 of going for housing growth. What I'll do now is turn it over to Stuart to give you some thoughts and reflections.
All right, thanks, Shane. So here I'm just going to reflect on a couple of the policy changes that Shane introduced, which make up the stage 1 announcement. I want to be clear and just reinforce the disclaimer that we started, that was on one of the earlier slides, that these are my views. They don't represent the views of either the Housing Expert Advisory Group that I'm a member of, or the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development that I'm advising, nor the government. They're my views on what's been announced. And I think Shane's already given you a bit of a hint of what we think the big questions are. The first is around greenfield development and the concept of growth paying for growth. The second is how we calculate housing growth and why I personally think that many places, for example, Auckland, just have not enabled enough. They're just systematically underestimating the demand for housing. And I'll give you a little example and calculation of that. And the third is this definition of strategic transport corridors and how, in my view, depending on how those corridors are defined, it could really turbocharge the MPS and really sort of make or break what we get out of this next tranche of reforms. All right, next slide. So greenfields development. I just wanted to start off with asking the question, because I don't think it's obvious to a lot of economists, but it's not obvious to everyone. What are the benefits of enabling greenfield growth? And one answer to this question from an urban economic perspective is that if you allow land outside of the city to be used for urban development, then it supports competitive land markets across the whole city and helps to reduce land prices. So there's a very strong price effect when you have a good supply of land for development on the edge of the city. It does reduce prices across the whole city. That's not to say that you necessarily need a lot of rural development. It's not commenting on the share of greenfields versus brownfields. It's just saying that you need a competitive market for land, and that will reduce land prices more broadly. Now, Shane alluded to these concerns. There are, I have heard concerns that enabling greenfield development could lead to sprawl. A couple of comments on that. I think our perception of sprawl has been shaped from what we've seen over the last few decades, especially from 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. To today. Now, the historical drivers of the sprawl that we saw in those decades are actually fading. And what I mean by that is in those decades, we had rapid growth in vehicle ownership. We had significant investment in highways, expanding urban highways. And those two things together really did enable cities to expand. If you think of the present, especially in our major cities, our roads are now congested, whereas they weren't before. And that provides a very strong economic handbrake on people's ability to just move to the urban periphery and commute to jobs in the city. So transport congestion is acting as a handbrake now on urban sprawl, much, much more so than it was in the past when we had just built these highways and they were relatively uncongested. The second bullet point there that I think leaves me a little bit glass half full on this tension between greenfields development and managing growth is that there is this desire that growth pays for growth. Now that is actually it's a simple statement and the reality is much more complex, but there is a desire across governments going back most of the last decade to better internalize the costs of urban development to the developers. So, you might see some of the water reforms that are going through now as a way of getting better management of water infrastructure, obviously at a high level, but in particular, getting better price signals to people who are proposing to develop, either in the urban area or on the urban fringe. And the third point there is sort of highlighting that we're trying to shift our expectations of sort of greenfield growth from sprawl, which we've seen, to new towns. And one of those historical drivers of sprawl in the past, I think, has probably been undercharging for development. So we've gone from we've sort of had decades of undercharging for urban development, and we're trying to correct that now and internalize those costs a bit better so that we can actually fund the infrastructure that is needed to support these new communities. But I fundamentally don't think we should be opposed to the concept of new towns or new communities on the edges of our cities and elsewhere. I think we can do that, and there are examples from countries overseas where they have been able to build new towns quite effectively. So that's greenfields growth. In terms of estimating housing growth, a lot of these policies are we're going to change the way we're going to move to a 30-year timeline for housing growth, and that's great. But there's an underlying question of how you actually calculate housing growth. In my view, current estimates are far too low. And I've just got a little example that I work through here with you where I say, let's think about 3 contributors to the housing demand. One is just population growth. The second is falling average household size. And the reason the average household size tends to be falling is because we have an aging population and people are having fewer children on average. And then the third point there is around real income growth. And a lot of people miss this one. It's really important. When people get wealthier, when their real incomes grow, which they have tended to do over the long run, they demand more housing. And they demand more housing in 2 key ways. They might demand a larger house, so a larger floor area, or they might demand more secondary dwellings. So that's things like a holiday house and what have you. So you can't, sorry, just don't go on yet. You can't ignore the income growth channel. And if you do, then you will underestimate the future demand for housing in a situation where incomes are growing, which is what we've seen in the past. So I've put some numbers to it there, and if you work through what I think are quite conservative assumptions around those 3 inputs, you get to an implied growth rate in housing demand of about 1.75%. Now that is about 2 to 3 times higher than Auckland Council's estimates for Auckland. So that's how I arrive at the conclusion that I think the way councils are currently estimating future demand for housing is leading to estimates that are systematically too low. And that's a driver for some of these policies you've seen around that Shane mentioned around and going for housing growth of requiring councils to use high demand projections. I think that's a step in the right direction. I don't think it's enough though, because I think it takes us part of the way to closing this gap, but I don't think it gets us all the way. And the final point there to keep in mind is that all of these things like population growth and household size and possibly income growth are endogenous to housing supply and costs. So what that means is if we enable more housing and housing costs are lower on average, then we can expect to see more growth. So it's possible that, when we move to a more enabling settings for housing supply, we will see faster growth than what we've seen in the past. Next slide. One side note here around the proposed amendments, and Shane mentioned this as well, is the role of price indicators. And I want to highlight how that role for price indicators might interact with private plan changes. So, okay, let's say councils have estimated demand, and it is what it is, even if we think it's too low. If these price indicators keep going south and keep deteriorating, then that will provide policy support for private plan changes. That is a market signal that councils haven't enabled enough, regardless of what they think. And in that context, you might see policy providing support to proposed private plan changes as a market check on councils' housing growth estimates. And the general idea from these sorts of these policy changes is that if councils don't enable enough, such that these price indicators deteriorate, then they can expect to face more private plan changes going forward. Okay, finally, and then we'll wrap up and open it up to questions. This notion of upzoning, requiring upzoning around strategic transport corridors like key bus routes. As a hypothetical example, if we were to require 6 stories around Auckland's frequent bus network, for example, so these are bus routes that operate at 15 minutes or better frequencies, 7 days a week from 7 in the morning to 7 at night, that would result in a large increase in capacity for urban development. That would be quite a game changer, I think. So that's worth keeping an eye on, because if we get that right, then we'll might go a large way towards to enabling more supply and getting us back to historical levels. And one footnote there is that in tier 1 cities, the upzoning that is associated with these strategic transport corridors will also interact with that mixed use policy, that they'll have to enable mixed use. They'll have to upzone around strategic transport corridors and enable mixed use. So there's an interaction effect there that you want to keep an eye on. All right, so some final thoughts, and then we'll open it up. On balance, I think it seems that the Going for Housing Growth workstream is strengthening the MPS and it's weakening the MDRS, making it optional. So in the long run, the extent to which that stronger MPS can offset that MDRS will depend, I think, on pending decisions. So there's a lot of good stuff in what's been announced that will increase housing supply. As to whether those initiatives that increase supply are enough to offset the MDRS optionality, I think the jury's still out, and it will depend on where we land on these strategic transport corridors and where we land on how we calculate these 30-year housing growth targets. That's my personal view. And just reiterating that final point around the effectiveness of these Going for Housing Growth policies around enabling supply is likely to hinge on those changes to infrastructure funding and financing. So that's the second work stream. You've seen a lot of proposed institutional and pricing reforms recently, or you may have seen in the news. So there's been, successive governments have been working on water reforms and trying to split them out from councils and put them on a sort of more standalone footing so that they can sort of self-fund their infrastructure needs, and where necessary, borrow more. And where necessary, charge users more or charge developers more. And then recently in the news, just yesterday, around congestion pricing. So once again, just highlighting that the extent to which we get greenfield sprawl in the past, when we didn't have congestion pricing, might be quite different from what we get going forward if we can get congestion pricing over the line and let people know that if they move to these rural peripheral areas, that they will be facing a charge to drive into the city. I think that's it. Oh, one final thing. Oh yeah, I've got to give you a plug for our short course. So if you're interested in this stuff and you want to find out more, then Shane and I are running a 3-day short course in October. You can find the details on this side, and the register here button at the bottom is a link that takes you to a site where you can register. So with that, I think we're done. Thank you, everybody. And yeah, let's house our people. I live in Australia, but you know, I could just as well live in New Zealand if we can build a few more houses.
Be great to have you back. Thank you, Shane and Stu. We've got a lot of great questions coming in. We're going to go in terms of the ones that have been upvoted. So first of all, how do we ensure that enablement results in growth at scale rather than land banking and trickling development to maintain higher home prices? What is the incentive for developers to lower costs, and where has this type of enablement reduced the value of new homes?
Well, so that's a very thorough question, and a great question. I don't know if you had initial thoughts, Stu, or I can.
I'm happy for you to go. I
Or,
have lots of thoughts.
yeah, I have lots of thoughts as well. I mean, so this issue of land banking, for instance, is one that I've thought a lot about, and I, I think there's a few things that are a bit of hobby horses of mine. Things like ratings based on land value as opposed to uh, capital value, which would basically slightly disincentivize it would incentivize people to use their land more efficiently. There's also the issue of where they've done in other jurisdictions, like a vacant land tax. That's not necessarily one that I'm in favor of. I'm not an expert enough on it to say one way or the other. But there are those mechanisms that are in place. And I do think it is a real concern around developers that drip feed the market. Before I pass it over to Stuart, one thing I'll mention is if we do allow for, if we get rid of, say in Auckland, get rid of the rural urban boundary, that means there are a lot more landholders that hold land that could have development on it. So even if some try to land bank, there will be others who potentially bring that land to market. So having more players in the market is good for that. So I'll just say those few things because the question was very long and very good, but I don't remember all of it. So I'll pass to Stuart.
Yeah, so there was a lot in there to unpack. So I think that the question is, how can we ensure that greenfields development pays for the infrastructure that it needs, and that we get some sort of coordination, I guess, across landowners, because the land ownership might be fragmented, and that might lend itself to less coordinated development outcomes and less complete communities. I think that's a good question. My answer to that would be really around infrastructure and strategic planning, and as much as possible trying to shift the risk for lumpy investment, so like wastewater treatment, to developers. So let's think of hypothetical examples where you have a development that might require say 2,000 dwelling wastewater treatment facility, but the minimum viable facility is 8,000 dwellings. And so historically, council has had to build the capacity that it thinks might be needed overall, but the developers only had to pay for a quarter of the capacity that is provided. Now, you could shift the risk from council to the developer and say, if you're going to develop, we have to provide this 8,000 dwelling wastewater facility, and we want you have to pay for all of it. And that's going to provide an incentive for you to go negotiate with your landowners, with your neighbors, to coordinate around the development. So there are ways that you can treat infrastructure costs and risk in terms of where they sit to encourage the sorts of outcomes that you want. And I think that's what you will hopefully see in the infrastructure funding and financing reforms. Cool. And just as an example, there was a question about an example. I mean, I would say, it's controversial, but what we're seeing, the discussions around Drury in Auckland are very much in this category of new towns, right? We're talking about 50, 100,000 sort of dwellings arranged around a series of train stations between Papakura and Pukekohe, and there's some big scale infrastructure investment going in there to facilitate that. And as a result, we're having to think big in terms of how much housing we enable. It's not of a sort of trickle death by 1,000 cuts type scenario. Yeah.
All right, next. What are your views on housing targets and greenfield growth required at a council level versus the regional level? E.g. in the Wairarapa, Wellington, Horowhenua region, our housing market operates at a regional level, not necessarily a city level, and targets could be set regionally.
That's an excellent question. Shane, do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, so I guess I do. So there's often, so when we talk about tier 1 and tier 2, right, we often talk about it as tier 1 authorities or tier 2 authorities, but actually the tiers are defined by geography, right? And so it applies to, so the Wellington is a tier 1 geography, and whatever I guess whatever local authorities are part of that are required to meet these things, right? So it does mean that they have to work together. So I do think that those targets are if I'm interpreting the question correctly, and all of the proposals correctly, they would be at that more regional level in general. Now, how far out that applies to, I don't know off the top of my head, but that's my first thought on that, is that I think it does apply to more of the metropolitan area, if you think of it that way, rather than just a like in Auckland, it doesn't really matter because it's a unitary authority, right? And it covers the whole huge region, but in other parts of the country, it does.
Yeah, I think Wellington is the obvious region where some level of regional coordination around housing would be really super beneficial. Probably Christchurch as well. I think there are examples from memory. I'd have to fact check this, but I think there are examples of TAs coordinating. I can't remember if it was Hamilton or one of the cities actually did coordinate with sort of surrounding TAs. So it's probably, it would be nice to, I guess it would be nice for policy to encourage that sort of coordination. Whether it happens or not is a different question. But I'm also thinking there were some good elements of the previous planning reforms that I think tried to encourage the planning reforms proposed by the previous government that tried to encourage spatial planning at a more regional level. And so there may be value in sort of picking up some of that work and continuing it forward. So yeah, that's a good question.
Right. What's the expected timing of the release of the infrastructure planning and funding parts of the policy?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Shane?
No, I was going to say if anyone knows, it would be Stuart, but
I don't know, and if I did know, I wouldn't tell you. So
yeah. All right.
So, good question, but I'll let that go through to the keeper.
Okay.
Well, let's say hopefully soon, but
cool. Stu, can you clarify the change in Auckland rents you mentioned? 30% reduction. Is that the rate of increase compared to trend? Overall rents have continued to climb from all the data I have seen.
So it's saying that the effect of the unitary plan upzoning was to reduce rents by 20 to 30% compared to where they would have been otherwise. So that last statement is basically where rents would have been otherwise is the counterfactual. It's the hypothetical world that we would have seen if we hadn't have done the unitary plan. So yeah, the unitary plan reduced rents compared to what we would have expected to see otherwise. That is entirely compatible with the scenario where rents keep growing though. But one thing to keep in mind is that I think that, there's lots of different measures of housing affordability. The earlier graphs that I presented were sort of housing costs as a share of income. From what I've seen, housing costs as a share of income in Auckland has been falling. So rents have been growing, but on average growing slower than incomes over sort of, since the unitary plan went ahead. So that is what you would expect. And it's basically saying that after, that people have rents and housing costs are making up a falling share of people's overall expenditure. To the point now, which is quite extraordinary in my experience, housing costs as a share of income in Auckland, from what I can tell, are less than the rest of New Zealand. And that's extraordinary because Auckland is the largest city and usually housing costs as a share of income in cities are higher than other places. I mean, Hobart, for example, in Australia, which is a city of about 150,000, from what I can tell, Hobart has a higher cost share, housing costs make up a higher share of income than in Auckland. So yeah, I think it's possible that rents have continued increasing while affordability has improved on average. That would be my expectation.
Yeah, and if I could just slightly add to that, I'm almost certain you're correct about your Auckland being slightly more affordable than the national average in terms of average income, average rents. And that, as you said, is extraordinary. One thing that I'll just throw out there is what those average metrics don't capture, right, is the people at either end. And so it doesn't give us an idea of, like, say, the lowest 20% of income households, how they're faring against rents. But the overall trend is largely a good news story that, like,
exactly.
Yes, rents are going up, but incomes have been going up faster on average.
Yeah, no, these indicators they're just sort of proxies that, no indicator captures the full story. So Shane mentions that it's an average, it doesn't capture distributional effects. One of the other things it doesn't capture is quality differences or compositional differences between the populations in Auckland versus the rest of the country. But one thing I will point out is if you go back to when the unitary plan occurred, housing costs as a share of income in Auckland at that point were higher than New Zealand as a whole. So we've swapped positions. Auckland has gone from being more expensive on that measure to being less expensive. So that's why, and you see it in the Going for Housing Growth policy announcement as well. The emphasis there is on price indicators not deteriorating over time. So you can have differences in levels, but the key thing is we want them to be pointing in the same direction, moving in the right direction. Yeah.
All right. How do you see Going for Housing Growth working for non-city Tier 1 councils, e.g. Selwyn, New Christchurch, that already rezoned a large area of greenfield subdivision under the MPSUD, enabled private plan change?
Shane, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess so. It could be, and I'm purely speculating because I don't know the details of, say, Selwyn, and what their plans are. But it could very well be that when all is said and done, that these places are already meeting the targets that have been laid out. That's a possibility. That would be my first reaction, is that these rules or policy are put in place, are being floated as not as nobody is meeting these targets and now we're going to make everybody meet them. They're being put in place as, we think these are good targets to meet and we're going to check to make sure that they are being met. And in some places they may very well already be. That would be my first take. But I don't know if you had anything else to add to that.
Could you say the question again, Pippa? Sorry, I wasn't quite sure.
I mean, I think you may have cut out at the end also, Pippa. So
Oh, apologies. So it was basically around how it applies. Oh, where's the question gone? Oh, there we go. How do you see it working for non-tier 1 councils, for example, Selwyn? and
Okay.
rezoned. They've rezoned a large area already under the MPSUD.
Okay, well, good on Selwyn. And I also think it's worth a shout out to Rotorua District Council here, who have opted into Tier 1, even though they weren't defined as a Tier 1 city. So they get a big thumbs up from me. I guess there's two things I'd mention here. So there's, so there's the Rotorua case where councils can opt into Tier 1, and I hope they do. Like I would like to see more councils opt in. Maybe that again is a bit naive. The other thing to mention is that the minister has the authority to add Tier 1 cities over time, and you might say maybe Selwyn always should have been a Tier 1 city because it's part of that wider metropolitan sort of agglomeration in Christchurch. But you might also I would also make the case that Queenstown should be a Tier 1 city, and others have made that case as well. So if councils choose to do stuff voluntarily to enable more supply, I mean, that's great. I really respect that. And it sounds like Selwyn and places like Rotorua are in that category. But I would also just point out that if, for example, price indicators continue to deteriorate in some of these smaller cities and towns, that they could well be added to the Tier 1 list over time. And so it's worth getting ahead of the game so that you're not having to react.
All right, one of these has put a few questions down, but I'm going to ask this one. What lessons from international housing policies have been integrated into the GfHG, and how do these comparisons shape the anticipated outcomes in the New Zealand context?
Stu, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, could you say it again?
Yeah.
These are good questions. They're complex.
Yeah. What lessons from international housing policies have been integrated into the GfHG? And how do these comparisons shape the anticipated outcomes in the New Zealand context?
International lessons. I mean, I guess there's good practice sort of regulation of utilities like water. Like I think we in terms of infrastructure, we do well in some sectors and poorly in others. And the two that Infrastructure Commission Te Waihanga has called out that have done worse than average are water and transport. So there's no, it's not surprising that when you think about these institutional and pricing reforms, like the water utilities and the congestion pricing, that's why we see so much reform in those sectors. And I mean, we don't have congestion pricing in New Zealand, but if you look to places like Singapore and Stockholm and Göteborg in Sweden, then you can learn from that. So I think on the infrastructure side, there's a lot we've been learning from overseas. On the housing policy side, we actually have, in terms of the evidence, a lot of the evidence, the really good evidence comes from New Zealand, and it comes from the Auckland Unitary Plan and the effects of that on the supply of housing, the rents, the supply of social housing or state housing. It was really beneficial on all those metrics. So we actually don't, and also lower hut, I should say. There's robust studies of the effects of upzoning and lower hut. So we don't need to go overseas. That's not saying that we still couldn't. And I'd say that the obvious, and one example would be Japan around mixed use zoning. Japan has, Japanese cities tend to have very enabling approaches to mixed use, especially for restaurants and hospitality. So that's an area where I think we've been trying to learn. It's also fair to say that most of the Anglo countries have actually been performing pretty badly, at least in terms of direction. So Australia has historically done really well, but their trend is down. Their rate of housing construction seems to have sort of been falling over time. Canada hasn't got great outcomes. The UK is abysmal. Even the US, which historically has been a very elastically supplied housing market, there's research showing that their housing supply elasticities have fallen significantly over time, actually fallen by about 2/3. So in this space, I would almost encourage us to look. I think we should look more to non-English speaking countries like Japan and maybe a little bit less to our who we might think of as our normal cultural rivals, should we say?
Cool.
Shane.
Right.
Oh,
I
we're
think
time.
we're
Sorry.
going to have to end it there, but there's an awful lot of excellent questions in the Q&A, so I am going to commit Shane and Stuart to going through those and finding another opportunity to respond. But I want to extend a big thanks to both Shane and Stu for sharing their knowledge and getting us to all think today. Also, thank you very much to everyone who attended. It's great to see the discussion that's occurring both in the Q&A and the chat. Thank you for that. Hopefully we'll go away with so the following key messages: that New Zealand has a major housing supply problem, that a decade of supply side policy reforms means we have now turned a corner, and the Going for Housing Growth represents the next step in these reforms and seeks to strengthen the role of the NPSUD. The success of this will hinge on key answers to key policies like how do we manage greenfields growth, how to calculate housing growth, and how to define strategic transport corridors. You'll all receive an email from us shortly with access to this recording, and we'll be in touch regarding the other questions. And also, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any further questions. Mā te wai, have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Yeah.
Pippa.
Thanks, everyone.